Hi everybody and welcome to the most detailed guide I've ever done, and where I'm gonna show you how to paint one of the Scythes of the Emperor that appeared in the Astartes II trailer. So this guide and color scheme is inspired by the Astartes II trailer, and by the way, there is also a giveaway involved. And to start off, we're using Pro Acryl Blue to base coat all the parts that will appear orange. Of course, we also need to base coat the belt, and this is a good opportunity to switch between parts. So from the chest to the belt, let the first layer of the chest dry a little bit and then do another coat until it's fully covered. And of course, we also gonna paint the iconic knee pads, one with a stripe and one fully covered in orange. And we also need to base coat the backpack power unit of the power armor. And as you can see, I'm using a little bit of a bigger brush for the whole base coating. And in this case, it's a Arches Opus Series S size 1 brush. And the one thing I love about this Arches Opus Series S brushes, and why I always paint with them, is that they have a really long tip, which helps me to keep a huge amount of paint in the bristles, and they also have a really sharp tip, and this helps me to maintain the precision. And just a little bit of color theory for the skeptics out there. We're using blue as a base coat because it's the complementary color of orange. Orange covers really nice on blue, blue covers really nice on black. And with blue as a foundation for the orange, we can also create a super nice natural shading for the orange armor parts. In the next step, we're gonna create volumetric reflection highlights on the black armor parts, and for this we're gonna use Vallejo Basalt Gray and mixing it down with 3 parts water to 1 part paint. And the key point here is to create the right mixture, that we have a translucency that gives us the opportunity to create smooth transitions between the black and the gray layers. And to do so, we're simply always moving our brush into the brightest direction of the highlight. You've seen this a couple of seconds ago as I've painted the upper part of the knee pad. I simply moved my brush from the right side into the center of the highlight. Then I moved my brush from the left side in the center of the highlight, which resulted in a smooth transition and also collecting all of the pigments in the center of the highlight. And what I am doing now is I'm still doing center focused highlights, but instead of using the side of my brush, I'm now creating small brush streaks, still center focused. As you can see, I started from the right side, now I'm coming from the left side. And this brush streaks will support the reflective look of the armor in a later stage if we glaze in back some of the black. And if you don't know where to place your highlights, simply prime your mini black, take it under a lamp, make a photo and use this photo as a reference where to place your highlights. And this is probably the part that consumes most of the time while painting this mini. And this is mainly because the highlights now are much bigger than in later stages where we will add a little bit more of contrast to the highlights. And it's the main definition of the black armor parts. So just take your time, relax, and enjoy painting. Something that directly popped into my eyes as I've watched the Astartes II trailer was the high reflective surface of the black armors. And to support this effect a little bit more, we also add on all of the sharp edges of the armor edge highlights with the Vallejo Basalt Gray, and also intense the contrast in later stages with brighter gray tones. And here you can see where I have placed my highlights so far. Don't worry too much about that the transitions are not so smooth. We will smooth them out with some black in a later stage. To improve the contrast of the reflection highlights, we're using neutral gray, also of Vallejo, also mixed down with 3 parts water to 1 part paint to create a translucent mix. And this translucent mix helps us now to create a smooth transition between the basalt gray and the neutral gray. And we're doing this in the same pattern as we did before. We create brush streaks, always center focused, so we start from the right side, moving the brush into the center, then we're starting from the left side, moving also the brush into the direction of the center of the highlight. And for the size of the second highlight now, I would recommend you basically half of the highlight underneath. I should mention here that I switched directly from an Artis Opus Series S size 1 brush, which I used in the Basalt Gray stage, to an Artis Opus Series S size 00 brush. And I did this to create smaller brush streaks for the volumetric highlights and tinier edge highlights. And for the edge highlights, I would recommend you now to only paint the upper and the side edges to improve the contrast by still remaining some of thicker basalt gray edges on the lower parts. And I'm gonna be honest with you here, this is still a stage that will take some time and you need some patience to get through this, but the difference compared to the Basalt Grey stage is that if you have pushed the contrast a little bit further on a couple of the highlights, you will see that the effect is starting to work. And this is something I always enjoy. If a miniature is starting to look like a miniature instead of a primed or black primed huge amount of plastic, this is something really enjoyable. So just enjoy painting and creating a piece of art. One thing I would be really happy about is if you would give me some feedback about the new setup with the wet palette now visible with the different angle. And I don't know if you noticed it, but instead of accelerating the video speed, I simply just used the whole recordings now. This makes the videos much longer, so in this case 1 hour longer basically, but I thought it might help a couple of people to be able to see more precisely what I'm doing and how I'm doing it, and this is basically what I wanted to achieve. So I would be really happy if you give me some feedback about all the changes. We're now moving on in a little bit of a back and forward section of the black armor part. And what I'm doing now is I'm mixing up a glaze to give the armor a little bit back of its black and smooth out the transitions between the gray and black layers. And we're mixing this up with Pro Acryl Glaze and Wash Medium and Pro Acryl Coal Black. The glaze and wash medium is around about 2 parts, the paint is 1 part, and I also add 2 parts of water here. And then I load up my brush within the mix and wipe it off on a kitchen towel and start to glaze in some transitions by darkening the basalt area a little bit more down. And we're not doing this with traditional glazing with the side of the brush, no, we're doing this also like we did on the highlights by creating little brush strokes, and this is important to keep up this reflective look we want to achieve. and I switched back to a Artis Opus Series S size 1 brush. What's really helpful by using this kind of technique instead of creating super smooth transitions in the first go is with this glaze I'm also able not just to smooth out the transitions and create a little bit more of brush marks, no, I'm also be able to darken down certain areas where more of shadow would be appear. So if my highlights are too big, I can simply tone them down so that it looks much more like a shadowed area basically. One thing that I should probably also mention here is I use Green Stuff World Matte Black Surface Primer, and the perfect color match for this primer is Coal Black of Pro Acryl. This is why this basically works hand in hand perfectly to go with the black primer, then apply a couple of grayish highlights and smooth them out with a coal black glaze in this case, or fix things with pure coal black. If you go for Abaddon Black, you should also go for the Games Workshop Black Primer, which I think it's called also Abaddon Black or Chaos Black. I'm not quite sure. And this is what I meant by, this is a little bit of a back and forward section. If I'm not happy with a highlight or a shape, I just go back to my gray tones and fix the shape of the highlight, or if I miss the area, I simply paint in a new highlight, and then I go back to the glaze and smooth the transition out again. If I like recess shades a little bit more in deeper recesses, or if I messed up with a gray brush stroke covering a recess shade, I also simply fix this in sections like this. And then you should end up with something like this, and we can now move on to real high contrast highlights. And to create this high contrast highlights, we're using Vallejo Pale Grey Blue mixed down with 3 parts water to 1 part paint. And one thing I should mention here again is if I mix up colors on my wet palette, I use in most of the cases a cheap synthetic brush to protect my regular brushes. And for this highlights, we're switching back to Artis Opus Series S size 00 brush, and the main thing we're doing now is we're creating light reflection highlights and upper edge highlights just to increase the contrast and give the armor a very reflective look. I'm spending a little bit of more time into the head area and add a couple of more highlights just to get the viewer's attention into this area. And this is because I want to paint in black reflective eye lenses in a later stage, and I simply want the viewer's attention right into this area because I really love this iconic look in the Astartes II trailer. And to get a little bit of more extra attention, I'm loading up my brush with some water, thinning the pale grey blue mix a little bit more down, and stipple on a reflection highlight on the front part of the helmet. And what you've probably already noticed is I never paint the fully upwards facing edge. I always just paint 1 to 2/3 of the edge, and this is simply just to create a natural reflective look and also creating transitions between the former layers of gray. And because I also wanted the right arm to get a little bit more of extra attention, I added 2 small reflection highlights within the volumetric highlights. And then you should end up with something like this. And as you can see, the black is already looking really deep again and high reflective as well. And we're moving over to orange of Pro Acryl and starting to cover up our blue base coat and creating a little bit of volumetric highlights and shadows. And to thin this mix down, we're simply just using the water that remains if we're dipping our brush into the water pot and wiping it off on a kitchen towel. So it's basically pure orange. And I also switched again back to a size 1 brush of the Artis Opus Series S. And for painting this volumetric highlight, we're simply pushing the pigment into the direction where the orange would appear brightest. And this is a part where we already really nicely can see how we profit from the complementary color spectrum. Yeah, I already mentioned that in the beginning of the video. So blue is the complementary color of orange and orange is the complementary color of blue. And this helps us while we are creating volumetric highlights with orange over blue to create a natural looking shade by maintaining some of the blue underneath. And the good thing is there's also a psychological effect involved, because complementary colors are always pleasant to look at, and this is what makes this in the end a really nice to look at orange. And this takes around about 2 to 3 coats to fully cover, in most of the cases only 2 coats, but if you have too much water in your brush, it will take probably 3 coats. I also recorded a huge amount of this step because I thought it might be really helpful to get a little bit more of insight how I move my brush in certain directions, how I place highlights and stuff like that. I think it's probably around about 15 minutes all in the video about the orange part, but I think it's totally worth it to see how to work with complementary colors and create light and shadows with volumetric highlights and complementary colors. And I thought it might also help a couple of you to get a little bit more of a feeling how to place volumetric highlights in certain different cases. Simply sit back and enjoy while I paint and show you how to create this volumetric highlights. And while we're watching this long orange part, we can talk about a thing I've never mentioned in one of my videos before, by the way. It's basically, if you paint volumetric highlights, one of the key features to make it look nice and appear in a realistic way is that you have to take care of the shape of a volumetric highlight. And this is why I tell people in basically every of my video that they should take a reference photo while the mini is still primed, because if you have a natural light bouncing off the surface, you will always see how the shape of a realistic highlight would appear. And this helps you to imagine where and in what kind of a shape you have to create a volumetric highlight on your mini. And next we're using glaze and wash medium of Pro Acryl and mixing it with 1 part paint and 1 part glaze and wash medium. And we're using this mix to create a little bit more of a translucent orange color we can use to create smooth transitions between the popping out orange part and the deep shaded blue parts. And because I was messing up with the backpack a little bit, we have now to create a recess shade we can use to fix up some recesses on the backpack. We're mixing 1 part Pro Acryl blue with 2 parts glaze and wash medium and 1 part water, simply to fix up some of the recesses I messed up with. And here's something I cannot repeat frequently enough. Don't worry too much about mistakes, they happen to everyone. It doesn't matter if you're a beginner, if you're a golden demon painter, or if you're the God Emperor himself. Mistakes happen, you've seen that in the Heresy, and almost every mistake in miniature painting can be fixed. There are probably a couple that cannot be fixed, like dropping your mini in a bottle of super glue, for example, but in most of the cases, it can be fixed. And if you're done by creating your basic volumetric highlights for the orange part, you should end up with something like this. In a later stage, we will add also a couple of reflection and edge highlights to the orange parts as well. And next we're using Vallejo Gunmetal Grey to base coat all of the metal parts. I'm doing this always by adding some of the Vallejo Gunmetal Grey into a metal pot and using an old brush to base coat all of the surfaces that should appear metallic. by the way, I would be really proud if you like, share, or even subscribe to my channel. I'm also always happy about feedback in the comments section about my work. Just always keep in mind, be constructive in your feedback. If you're that kind of guy that simply writes something like, "Why didn't you do like that?" exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, and "I want that!" exclamation mark, exclamation mark, I simply just ignore it. Just a little reminder here, never use your regular brushes to paint metallics. The problem with metallic paints is that the pigments in metallic paints damage your brush bristles, brush brushage. Okay, now I've said it too many times and I cannot spell it anymore here. You know what I mean. So just keep in mind to keep your old brushes as spare brushes and simply use them for metallic paints. I also have a separate water pot where I clean my brushes I use for metallics and effect colors. And next we're going to Pro Acryl Rich Gold and base coat the gold parts of the Mini, and here you can finally see how I mix up a 1-to-1 mix of Rich Gold and Vallejo Airbrush Thinner, which is my secret recipe to get metallics flowing super nice and get a super nice finish with basically every metallic simply by thinning it down with airbrush thinner. The most awesome thing about the Monument Hobbies Pro Acryl Rich Gold or Metallic series basically is even if you thin them 1-to-1 down with airbrush thinner, they're covering in one coat. And this is something that only the Vallejo Airbrush series can handle, and basically no other paint I've touched so far. This is basically a really fast part because we only need to base coat the chest eagle, the lower part of the tarbard, the ornament and the skulls on the arms. Our mini is starting to pop out already. Just base coated with the metallics and a couple of volumetric and reflection highlights on the black armor and the orange parts. And what we're gonna do now, we're adding a little bit of depth and shifting the color of the gold more into an orange direction to fit a little bit more in the color scheme. And we're doing this with a 2-to-1 mix of Guilliman flesh and water, so 2 parts water, 1 part Guilliman flesh, and covering all of the gold parts. And after we finished up shading the gold parts, we're using Contrast Black Templar with 2 parts water to 1 part paint and shading all of the silver metal parts. And in this case, I've selected Black Templar Contrast as a base color because it has a slight green shift in it, like Incubi Darkness basically. And we will also use Incubi Darkness later on to highlight a couple of things on the mini, like the subsuit and the dark black reflecting eye lenses. And after we are done with the shading of the silver metal parts, we're heading over to use some Incubi Darkness in a 1-to-1 mix, so 1 part water, 1 part Incubi Darkness, and then we're starting to paint the subsuit parts of the power armor. And I selected Incubi Darkness and other more bluish tones to highlight the subsuit to separate it a little bit more from the armor. And next we're using as a second highlight for the subsuit Thunderhawk Blue. And Thunderhawk Blue has really poor coverage. This is why we're using it straight out of the pot. And we're placing our highlights in the positioning where we placed our reflection highlights on the armor. And by now, if you have paid attention, you should know why blue is a good choice for orange color theme. Let me know it in the comments and I will select one of the comments which will receive at the end of the June a Space Marine 2 board game. For the loincloth, we're using Doomball Brown, and as you can see I simply just forgot to record the bottle as I was painting, so I recorded it afterwards. And we're mixing it down with 2 parts water to 1 part paint. And the idea behind this is that we have a very translucent mix that we can use to create volumetric highlights with light and shadow just with the black underneath. So the idea here is we are layering up multiple of these translucent layers of Doomball Brown in the lightened areas of the volumetric highlights and simply just use the black as a shade. And this helps us to don't get too much attention to this loincloth and simply keep it a little bit more in the background because it's just a simple accessory. And just to support the natural look a little bit more, we're creating a thick edge highlight on the light-faced edge of the loincloth, and this simply supports it with a little bit more of a high contrast, because Doomball brown compared to black is already a real high contrast, and light-faced edges are high reflective, especially on leather. And then we're moving on to some iron breaker, and we're mixing this iron breaker with 1 part airbrush thinner to 1 part color, and we're then simply just highlighting all of the silver metal parts and the bolts on the loincloth, and also the bolts of the backpack of the power armor. We're then moving back to basalt gray, and we're mixing this again down with 3 parts water to 1 part paint. And what we're gonna do now, we'll start to highlight the weapon casing in some kind of a rough pattern to create a little bit of a used look to this weapon casing. And so don't care about if it's not perfectly covering, this just supports the used look. We will anyways also create a little bit of a glaze wash in the shadowed direction in a later stage, just to smooth out the transitions and enhance this used look even a little bit more. And in the next step, we're again also using neutral gray like we did on the armor, also in the same mixture. So we're using 3 parts water to 1 part paint. And we're repeating the step we did for step 1 with the weapon casing. We're just adding a couple of rough volumetric highlights in rough patterns with remaining brush strokes to support this used look a little bit more. Compared to the step before, we're doing this time also edge highlights all around the weapon casing, just to support the sharpness of the weapon a little bit more. To finish up the highlights on the weapon casing, we're using pale gray blue, and in my case I simply just used the remainings on the wet palette and put a little bit of fresh water into it. And we're only doing a couple of light reflection highlights on the upper and light faced edges, just to give this a little bit more of contrast and a more interesting look, and that's basically it for the weapon casing. And to finish up the dirty look and create a couple of smooth transitions, we're then using coal black, thinned down with 2 parts glaze and wash medium and 1 part water, just to create a very translucent mix. And we're then simply just using a bigger brush, in this case Artis Opus Series S size 2 brush, to create a little bit of a shadowed glaze and add a little bit of a rough pattern into the shadowed direction, and this will smooth out the transitions and create also a little bit more of interest, which will finish the weapon casing in the kind of atmosphere we want to achieve. And with the Iron Breaker from the earlier stage, we're then also highlighting the bolts of the weapon casing to finally finish this up. To add a little bit more of variation and interest to the orange armor parts, we're then using Pro Acryl Ivory, and we're mixing this with 2 parts orange, so basically 2 parts orange with 1 part ivory to create a highlight mix. And then we're simply just starting to add a couple of highlights to the orange armor parts. And I'm focusing here on the upper edges, especially the edges on the neck, just to again give a little bit more attention to the head itself. And then I'm primarily highlighting all of the light facing edges to create a little bit more of light reflection highlights and support the feeling of light and shadow even more. For the volumetric light reflection highlights, I'm mixing my highlight mix down with 1 part color and 1 part glaze and wash medium, and create a couple of volumetric reflection highlights. I'm also using this to decently highlighting lower edges to give them a little bit more of a sharp look. And of course, I also start to highlight the backpack with a couple of light reflection highlights and also volumetric highlights. For the light reflection highlight on the knee pad, I'm then using again a stippling technique, and this is simply just because it's much easier to create a circular shaped reflection highlight with stippling than just moving my brushes in very strange angles. And don't forget to add a tiny light reflection highlight on the neck. This just supports the light and shadow feeling even a little bit more. We can then finally move on to also highlight the gold parts of the mini, and we're using bright gold of Pro Acryl, and we're mixing this again down with 1 part airbrush thinner to 1 part color, And a good thing about bright gold compared to rich gold is that it's not as heavily covering as rich gold does, and this supports us by creating smooth transitions for sharp edge highlights and volumetric highlights on the gold parts. And here is one thing that is important about this true metallic part. So we have created some kind of a non-metallic feeling on the black armor parts, and combining non-metallic with true metallic is problematic if you don't follow the same painting pattern. So it is really important that we also use volumetric highlights now and take care of the light and shadow, that all of this non-metallic and true metallic combination looks natural. And this is why I'm focusing here with the highlights primarily on the front part of the eagle. It would catch more light in the front part, so I'm adding a couple of more highlights in the front parts and just a couple of tiny highlights in the back part to keep this natural balance alive. And basically the same for the skulls, so I'm trying to focus here with the bright gold mix on the light facing parts of the skulls on the right and on the left arm as well. And for the chest eagle, I then decided to create a little bit more of a deep shadow, especially on the right part, which is more facing the shadow, and just give this a little bit more of a deep shade contrast. And to push the contrast even a little bit further on the metal parts, I then switched to silver of Pro Acryl and mixed it also down with 1 part airbrush thinner to 1 part color. And this color is again really heavily covering, so be very patient if you apply it for a couple of light reflection highlights. And as you can see, I'm just really focusing here on edges that would mostly catch the light, like the upper left edge, the lower right edge. On the eagle, it was primarily the wing feathers on the left side and just a couple of dots on the right side. And this just helps me to push the contrast, give this also a little bit more of light and shadow balance, and makes it also look much more natural. And for the cape, we're now switching to another different type of gray, in this case German gray of Vallejo, and we're mixing this down with 3 parts water to 1 part paint. And this was a little bit challenging for me because we have 5 different types of materials on this mini that should appear black. So we have the eyes, we have the subsuit, we have the reflecting armor, we have the weapon casing, and we also have the cape. And this is challenging because all 5 of these types made of different materials, say they should look a little bit different. So for the subsuit and the eye lenses, that is not so tragic, but for the armor and for the weapon casing, I could change the painting style a little bit to bring a little bit of variation in here, and they can almost match to each other. But for the cape, it's made of a cloak, and that's a whole different kind of material. So this is why I was going for a much darker first highlight color, and also created a couple of rough pattern volumetric highlights to create the look of cloth in this case. And even if I'm still painting really rough here, you can see I'm using primarily the side of my brush, and this just supports me by creating a little bit of a softer look to the cloth basically. So here is the quintessence you can take from that. If you want to create a reflecting surface, you can work with this brush strokes we've created on the armor to create some kind of reflection marks. And if you want to have softer transitions and surfaces that look a little bit softer, simply use the side of the brush. And one thing I should also mention here is that size does matter. And in this case, I switched now to a Artis Opus Series S size 3 brush, and this is just to have a bigger brush tip, which helps me especially if I use the side of the brush, and I can load up my brush with a huge amount of color and don't have to go too much back and forth between the wet palette and the cape itself. And for the next highlight on the cape, we're switching again back to Vallejo Basalt Grey, and we're mixing this again with 3 parts water to 1 part paint just to get our convenient, very translucent mix to create smooth transitions. And one thing I've learned from medieval paintings and artworks of cloth was that the light facing side always has a smooth transition in its highlight, while the shadow facing side has a hard cut in its highlight. And this helped me a lot as I realized that, because I never realized that in the real life, just on these paintings, to create much more realistic cloth paintings on my miniatures as well. So, and this is what I meant earlier. I'm now creating a real straight highlight for the shadow-sided area and just create a little bit of texture to fit into the painting style. And you can now see that this highlight is starting to look real natural because we have a much smoother transition on the lighter side and a real hard cut on the shadow-facing side. And as a final highlight for the cape, we can now move back again to neutral gray. We're mixing this again down with 3 parts water to 1 part paint, like we did in every gray color basically in the whole video so far. And we're now basically doing the same as we did in the stages before. We're making smooth transitions for the light facing side and hard cuts for the shadow facing side. We're scaling the highlight a little bit down, and to get a little bit of an orientation where to place your highlight, take your reference picture out and simply take a look where the brightest area on the highlight should be appear and place your highlight there and enjoy painting and finishing up the highlights on the cloth. And another thing we should do with this final highlight color is to highlight all the edges and create a couple of reflection highlights. For example, if you have damaged locations on your cloth or cape, simply just highlight the up-facing edges also with this bright highlight color. And as you can see, I simply just forgot to paint the primary reflection highlight on the front part of the cape, and I'm using now neutral gray to paint in the primary reflection highlight. And we will anyways, in a couple of seconds, use a transparent black mix to smooth out the transitions, and I can use this transparent black mix as well to bring in the right balance between light and shadow for this primary front highlight. And what we can do now, we can use our coal black transparent mix we have been using to tone down the weapon casing and create smoother transitions on the cape itself. We can also tone down a couple of highlights that are too bright on the cape by simply overglazing it with this mix. And another thing I do here is I create even harder cuts on the shadow-sided areas for the highlights to create an even more realistic transition. And here you can see how I'm fixing one of the highlights. I was going a little bit over the top, so I'm simply toning it down and changing the pattern a bit by glazing over it with this shadow mix. I'm using the same brushstroke pattern how I've been applying the highlights, and this simply helps me to reshape it even if I already was finished with the highlight itself. And to finish up the cape, I'm then using pure coal black mixed down with 1 part water to 1 part paint. And what I do now is I simply just paint in this pure coal black mix in the deepest areas of the cape to enhance the feeling of a real black cloth. And this is how your cape should look like now. I know there are still very hard transitions even in the front part, but that doesn't matter. Our satin varnish in the end will fix that for us. To apply a couple of decals, we're using now micro sole to soften the decals and apply them to the surface. And one of the most iconic decals I wanted to apply is the crossed sides on the helmet that also appeared in the Astartes II trailer. And I'm pretty sure a couple of you are wondering where I got these decals. So I found someone online which was called Impatient Tabletop. I don't know if it's a company or a person. But the fact that they had the original colored version, so yellow, which is the original color of the sides of the Emperor, and the Astartes II orange version convinced me to simply buy them there. And it was also near to Germany, so the shipping was not so expensive. And this is something I absolutely wanted as well. The iconic crossed sides that also appeared in the Astartes II trailer on the cape. There was only one trade-off with this decals, and this is basically that you have to cut them out your own. That's a little bit of annoying work, but it's totally worth it to spare the time of a freehand paint job in this case. By the way, this transfer is not included in the transfer sheet from Impatient Tabletop. It's an old unit marking from an old Ultramarine transfer sheet. And to integrate the decals a little bit more into the surface areas, I simply just used the highlight colors for my armor and stuff. And tried to place the highlights in the areas where I've placed them before, just to integrate these decals a little bit more into the armor, and this will improve the result in a massive way and will also take care that it looks really natural even if it's applied decals. And here you can see how I integrated the decals even a little bit more. I used my orange colors from the stage where I painted the armor and the highlights of the armor, and simple stipple on these colors to integrate them even more and make them look much more natural than they would be by just using the transfer color. And here you can see that I also added the reflection highlight into the decal that I've painting on the helmet before I applied the decal. And this is how it should end up. You can see I added a couple of highlights to the decals and integrated them a little bit more in the armor. And what I will do now for the cape, I'm using transparent black with my airbrush and a little bit of airbrush thinner to integrate the shadowed areas of the cape into the decals. And I simply just use the airbrush because I was really tired at that point. You can also do this with a brush by simply glazing into the direction of the shaded area, but trust me guys, to record this guide was really driving me onto the edge, and I hope you understand that I used an airbrush this time. And here is an example that I recorded you because I was realizing as I was airbrushing that it's probably helpful to see how I would create shades on a decal. I simply just use the same mix, 1 part airbrush thinner and 1 part transparent black, and then I simply just move from the lighted area into the darkened area. So I basically glaze the decal on the shadowed area a little bit down just to integrate it also into the light and shadow feeling of the whole miniature. And as a final step to integrate the decals a little bit more into the armor, we're using gloss varnish with a brush. This helps us to remove all of the gaps between the decals and the armor surface itself. So we simply just overcoat every armor panel with a full coat of gloss varnish to integrate the decals a little bit more. And then if we apply the satin varnish in the end, it looks as it was painted on basically. And this is how your mini should look like if you have covered every surface where a decal was applied with gloss varnish. I will also link you in the upper right corner how I painted the eyes. And now it's time to apply a full coat of Vallejo Premium Satin Varnish. And you can see now with the satin varnish everything looks balanced, the gloss is gone. Only one thing, there will be a separate video how I've created the base. But now it's time to take a look at the final result. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I hope you had some fun and I hope to see you soon.